This scene from the 1974 film Potop, The Deluge, depicts an old Polish custom known as the Kulig. This historic Polish tradition dates back hundreds of years. But did you know that besides being a raucous party moving house to house on sleighs, drinking and dancing the night away, it was at one point during its history a form of civil resistance and protest? Kulig is a sleigh ride party and winter tradition in Poland dating back to the 1500s. It involves a gathering of neighbors who go door to door on a horse-drawn sleigh, stopping at each house to eat, drink, dance, and sing, and only moving on to the next house when all the resources of the first house have been exhausted. With each stop, they pick up the new neighbor that they've just visited along with his family, creating a chain of carriages and sleighs, and eventually returning to the first house where the event began. This activity took place during Carnival, between the 6th of January, Three Kings Day, and Ash Wednesday, which formally ended the period of celebration, and Lent began. It was the last chance to eat, drink, sing, dance, be merry before the somber Lenten period in preparation for Easter. The Kulig became very popular in the mountain regions of Poland, where, during the cold winter months, it was a practical and easy way to make merry. Horses and carriages were plenty, alcohol was abundant, sheepskin blankets, furs, woolen pants and shirts were all on hand. The tradition spread throughout the country. Sometimes even parties of 20 to 50 sleighs and sleds joined in on the Kulig. The festivities took place deep into winter, when the joy of the Christmas holidays had begun to wear off, and the coming Lenten season meant an end to parties and debauchery. This was the last hurrah, known as ostatki in Polish, which literally means the last bits. This period was also known as zapusty, which translates literally to letting oneself go, reflecting the engorgement that was allowed and even encouraged during the carnival season. But organizing a kulig signified class and status. You weren't poor if you were organizing a kulig. Musicians were hired out, elaborate feasts were served, and tons of drinks were flowing well throughout the evening and into the night. Historically, it was mostly magnates and the upper class who were able to organize kuligs in the first place. So where do we get this term kulig, and what exactly does it mean? The word was apparently taken from the Czech koleg, which means a circle or a round. And this makes sense, since the party would go door to door, picking up neighbors, and eventually coming right back to where it started. So besides it being a giant party, I mentioned that the Kulig was actually a form of protest. During the partitions of Poland, Poland was divided between the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Prussian Empire, effectively erasing it from the map for over a century. The partitioning powers sought to suppress Polish culture, language, and identity in order to assert their own control. There was plenty of resistance, but it usually took a cultural and symbolic form, as open rebellion was heavily suppressed. And so the tradition of Kulig was actually a way of disobeying and keeping Polish culture and asserting our own traditions. A notable Polish historian and an invaluable record keeper of Polish culture at the time, Father Jędrzej Kitowicz, detailed the Kulig tradition, writing, 2 or 3 neighbors would get together, bring along their wives, daughters, sons, servants, and whoever they had at home of adult age, and would get on sleighs, riding over to the nearest neighbor without warning as to find him at home. Surprising him, they would demand food and drink to both people and horses, and would dance and party until all the food and drink in the stores was gone. Once they were through, they would take the neighbor and his household with them to the next neighbor, where they did the same. They would continue until they arrived back to the house at which they started. During a Kulig, not only did people celebrate the season and the start of Lent, they also socialized, struck business deals, and even arranged marriages. During the time of the partitions, the Kulig became more and more patriotic. Although dancing was always a staple of the Kulig, the only dances allowed during the partition years were of Polish origin. Therefore, only Polish dances like the mazurka, krakowiak, and polonez were allowed. Dances like the waltz, which were of foreign origin, were not at all allowed. And the dress code was equally patriotic. White ties and tuxes were really frowned upon, and instead, traditional dress code was encouraged. Kulig at this time was also becoming a more organized event. Whereas before people would drop in quite spontaneously, during the partition years, the travel routes were well established in the autumn. During the Kulig, in the late hours after all the dancing and fun was had, men would gather around and talk about country and world politics. The Kulig featured enough in Polish literature of the partition era that it can be considered a strong and distinct part of Polish culture. During the partition years, it became a symbol of Polish culture, and Polish identity. In 1783, Józef Wybicki wrote a 5-act comedy entitled Kulig, recounting the Polish tradition. Later, in 1861, Juliusz Słowacki, a famous Romantic-era poet, featured the Kulig in his work Jan Bielecki. So what may have started as a bit of carnival fun morphed into something quite political. Kuligs provided a covert and quiet way to protest the powers that partitioned Poland. They also maintained cohesion and a sense of Polish identity when it was quite literally being torn apart on all sides. Perhaps the largest and most ostentatious Kulig in Polish recorded history was one that was organized during the reign of King Jan III Sobieski. It was immortalized by the painter Józef Brandt almost 100 years later in a painting called Wyjazd z Wilanowa, Jana III i Marysieńki Sobieskich. From an article, it was described as a lavish affair. The Kulig set out from the Danilowicz Palace at 3 p.m. At the fore were 24 Tatars on horseback with the prince's servants, along with 10 sleighs pulled by 4 horses each, filled with musicians. After them, 107 sleighs pulled by 6 horses each were surrounded by young magnates on horseback. At the end, on a sleigh carved in the shape of a Pegasus, sat 8 young magnates, reciting poems by Ustrzycki and Chrościński. Coaches and carriages numbered 450, and all totaled with sleighs and sleds 1,000 vehicles. The sleighs were pulled by 8 horses each and lined with rugs and furs. They could fit a dozen or so distinguished young men. Along the way, they stopped at multiple palaces, visiting the most powerful and royal families of Poland at the time. Wherever they stopped, they were given the grandest of receptions, with the master of the house and the housekeeper handing over the keys to the food stores, allowing everyone to take as much as they wanted. The last stop was the palace in Wilanów, where the king greeted the whole party and continued the festivities into the early morning hours. What a party! The painting that captured this moment in history was likely painted in 1896, about 100 years after the fact. Reflected in it is a deep nostalgia and a yearning for the Poland that no longer existed on the map. The painting itself is enormous. The canvas measures 186 centimeters by 343 centimeters. And if you're doing the math in feet, that's approximately 6 feet by 11 feet. By painting it so big, Brandt essentially establishes it as a defining moment in Polish history and echoes that link between Kulig and patriotism. Today, Kulig as a national tradition is pretty much dead, but it's still a pretty popular tourist activity. So if you want to experience a Kulig, you actually can in a lot of the mountain regions of Poland. There are multiple companies in Poland that organize these kinds of tours, where for an hour or two, instead of going house to house, you either eat or drink in your sleigh and then usually end with a bonfire. Caroling is of course very encouraged. So as you can see, Kulig isn't your typical sleigh ride. It was a symbol of national unity and pride in Polish culture, and it undoubtedly factored into Poles' ability to keep Polish traditions and culture alive, at least in their minds, while they fought for sovereignty during the partitions. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, I would appreciate you liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel to grow. And if you'd like more content, I'll suggest my last video about the Kolenda tradition, the Polish Christmas caroling tradition, with a pagan twist. See you next time.